Hi, it's Alexis. Welcome back. If it's your first time here, welcome. My name is Alexis. I'm a relationship therapist, and here we talk about relationships. We talk about attachment in a very practical way. And today we will discuss a study trying to understand the predictor of intimacy, because I want to answer a question that is very close to heart, is why avoidants often fear intimacy. Because I used to be avoidant. I'm a former avoidant. And so in this video, we'll break down the psychology behind that fear. I'm going to share also some personal insights from my personal story, from client cases as well. And if you're dating an avoidant, this video will be extremely helpful for you, because you will be able to also implement new things, strategies or things very practically in your relationship if you want to connect and develop intimacy in your relationship. What is intimacy? That's a big question. I could have the whole video talking about this. That's not the point of this video. The intimacy, when we think, or if I were to ask people in the street, they would think automatically about sexuality. But it's obviously more than that. It's obviously more complex than that. I'm going to give you two definitions from the people who wrote the study, that actually I put the study that I used to create this video in the description. One definition is to discover oneself in relationships with others, which is very interesting, because when we think about intimacy, we think about an exchange, right? We think about connection. But here, it's also oneself in the relationship. What is very interesting with this definition is it also implies that the way we are depends also on the relationship we're in, and therefore the partner we're dating. Another definition that I like is to care for each other, to open oneself to the other person, to enjoy the closeness as well with empath. And again, it's this idea of being for the other, of investment. And that's why intimacy is crucial when we talk about relationships, because a relationship needs to be, you need to invest in the relationship, and you need to expect your partner to invest, not equally, because we're not counting points. Here in the work that I do, I try to step away from those mechanisms or patterns of people counting points in their relationships. The idea here is to open yourself to your partner, open yourself as well internally. The work that I do one-on-one with my clients is really about this. It's about understanding yourself, because if you understand yourself, your insecurities, your belief system, you'll be able to connect with your partner, because you know your limitation. And when I do couple counseling, it's also about understanding your partner's world as well. Most people say we have a communication problem. No, you have an understanding problem. And to me, intimacy is this idea of having empathy towards the other and making into actionable things. How can I connect at a deeper level with this human being that I'm sharing my life with? That's my kind of definition. And I'd be curious to hear your definition in the comment section, so let me know. Now, if I look at how researchers decided to measure intimacy, they had three criteria. The ability to open up. Again, openness is one of the main criteria. The ability to accept the partner's perspective, and this idea of experiencing positive emotions in a relationship. The third one seems a bit obvious. Obviously, we're in a relationship, therefore I should enjoy the relationship, otherwise I wouldn't be in this relationship. But for some people, it's hard. It's very hard to enjoy the relationship, because they associate this intimacy, they associate this closeness as something scary. And this is why I wanted to make this video, is to explain that for some avoidant people, for most avoidant people, this idea of vulnerability, of intimacy is scary. They associate it with something that could be perceived as a threat. It's going against their own belief system that we'll discuss in a second, and how they develop this belief system, because obviously we're going to talk about childhood. And this childhood, what happened in their childhood, will be the blueprint of how they decide to interpret or be as a partner in relationships. So for instance, the first element of intimacy, and we're going to talk about avoidant, is this, the first criteria out of 3 is the closeness with parents. So what happens is obviously those early bonds will shape our capacity to trust, to feel safe with our parents, with our caregiver. Let me give you an example. You have a kid falling from a bike. Scenario number 1, the mom or the dad runs to them and try to reassure them, care for them, get them a plaster, whatever, buy them a drink. They care for them. They're really empathetic and really sort of welcome their emotions. If they're crying, they will help them and soothe them. Scenario number 2, which would be more or less, if we exaggerate, the case of someone who develop later on an avoidant attachment style, is this idea of either the parent is not around, or the parent will try to undermine the pain they're going through. When I say those things, because sometimes we feel avoidance, they are the result of dysfunctional, abusive childhood. That's not the case. Most parents, they want to do what's best. And so, but the way they react sometimes could be a bit clumsy or not necessarily appropriate. And in that case, you could have parents saying like, oh, it's going to be fine. It's fine. Don't cry. So this don't cry could be either a form of don't be vulnerable and I'm going to punish you if you are vulnerable. But it's also a thing of like, this kid is crying. I'm trying to make them stop crying, right? And not all parents are therapists or understand how to react and positive psychology and all those things, and could say those things where the child will respond and understand and assimilate this idea of like, I'm not allowed to cry. I shouldn't cry. My emotions are not valid. And I can't necessarily rely on that person to soothe me. So that's the first element. The second element is emotional availability. What happens is if you have consistent emotional support for the child, that creates an element of safety, of trust. I can rely on this person. Similar to the bike example, when I'm sad, when I'm getting hurt, but I can rely on that person. When something happened at school, I can open up, right? He or she will respond, will listen to me. And therefore, emotions are valid. If I'm upset, if I'm sad. And also, you'll tend also to see, because the positive emotions also, you tend to see avoidant, not also willing to share their successes. So, personal story. Recently, I got nominated to go and speak at a TEDx conference. That's an amazing thing. I worked quite hard to get it. And in a way, I was having a hard time initially to share that to people. I didn't want to feel like I brag and in a way, it was hard for me to share that success. An example that you can find at home, if you have kids, and I think we're all guilty of that, at least I'm trying not to be that kind of father, is where we're always on our phone when our kids are around. We're always on our phone at home. And so you will have a kid who would want to connect with you, to talk about his days, to talk about his worries, etc., etc. And I don't know, it's going to be a makeup stats, but like 8 out of 10 parents at home, they're on their phone. Not always paying full attention to their children. What is the message we send to our children when we do that? You don't matter. This is more important. This is more exciting than your story at school, right? This is a typical example of thing that parent is not abusive, but he or she creates this idea in their kid's mind of, okay, I have to do it on my own. I can't share this to my primary attachment figure. I need to keep it to myself. The third element is the impact of unmet needs. So it's parents who are inconsistent or unavailable. So inconsistent would be parents who would one day be super caring, super attentionate, and the other day would be dismissive, would be very cold. That doesn't mean that your parent is bipolar. Sometimes we have parents who are super stressed, and therefore, if they have like a hard time at work, everybody will be affected in the family, and therefore you have peaks, ups and downs depending on their workload. That was the case for me. So you had like really amazing holidays, but then when we would go, rest of the year would be more like, I don't have time for that. When I'm super busy, I'm super stressed. I will flip in a second. It's not against you. I'm just stressed at work. And so what happens is, again, kids adapt to be self-reliant. They feel I can't depend on others because they have other things to do. So again, a typical case would be a kid asking for help. And this is the dilemma for parents. So if you have kids, try to understand this. It's about how can I raise my kids to be autonomous, to be independent, while making sure that they feel safe. Because in the case of most avoidants, we had parents who taught us, deal it with yourself. If you have this problem, you have to manage it yourself. You're grown up now. You don't need my help, right? And it's very hard to find the right balance because the other extreme, when you have parents doing everything for their kids, you're not teaching any form of autonomy. And when they are grown up, when they have problems, when they go in the workplace, they are not adapted to the real life, right? So it's finding the right balance, and it's very hard to do. I'm not saying that's the problem, is that you can't have perfect parents, but it's important for you, if you have kids, to be aware of this. So I'm trying to, as a dad, to really pay attention to those things. So for instance, when I'm at home, I'm trying. I know sometimes I'm on my phone, so I'm trying okay, they're with me 2 hours in the evening. Let's make the most of it. I will check my phone afterwards. I know it's very hard because I'm quite addicted to this thing. And the same when they're upset, they are crying, it's like figuring out, and it's sometimes hard because you see them in the evening, you're tired, you don't necessarily have the emotional or mental bandwidth to deal with those things, and you feel like they exaggerate, they are so dramatic in how they approach things. Again, we can't be perfect every single time, but it's figuring out and understanding those things. And so those elements create the condition of this belief system that most avoidant would create, is this idea of I need to be a castle. This is a very, very beautiful castle from Dordogne in France, a place that I visited last summer. When you think about it, and you're a teenager or young kid, you feel like, I'm a castle. I'm a fortress. Therefore, that's good, right? Who wouldn't want to be a fortress? I'm strong. I'm independent. I'm self-reliant. The problem is, it's very hard to get inside that castle. The problem is, especially back in the days, when you had those castles, how can you connect with people? You're sending a message to the world like, don't mess up with me. Don't try to interact with me because I can shut down. I will be protecting myself from the outside world, right? That's not necessarily the most welcoming thing ever. And so it's always this idea, and it took me a while to figure this out, of being strong, yes, has a lot of upsides, or at least having the impression of being strong, because I don't feel I'm necessarily strong, but having this idea of like, I'm strong, I'm independent, is actually could be detrimental when you have intimate relationship. Because intimacy is what makes the relationship work. Intimacy is what differentiates the relationship you have with your colleagues, potentially with your friends, than the relationship you have with your spouse. And that's why also avoidants, they love the workplace because they don't have to be independent, they don't have to be intimate. They can still be their fortress. It works just fine, right? Because the limitation of the relationships you have with colleagues makes it acceptable or easy to handle for avoidants because they don't have to be vulnerable, because and that's the key word here, vulnerability is what will create intimacy. We discussed at the beginning around this idea of openness in this definition of intimacy. Openness is opening the gates, right, of this. Opening the gate of this castle. This is what you have to do. You have to let go of this if you want to enter a relationship. And therefore you have to trust that the person won't be an invader, right? Because that's the thing. If you think as like myself when I was a bit younger, if I let anyone enter this fortress, it's going to be a mess. They're going to change who I am. They're going to force things on me. I won't be independent anymore, and I don't want this. So if you go back to the definition of or how we measure intimacy, first of all, ability to open up. And as we saw before, avoidant people, they withhold emotions. Sometimes they perceive that it's bad, right? Boys don't cry, this type of thing. Surprisingly enough, there's not a major difference in attachment theory between the gender difference between male and female when you look at avoidant, but this idea of like boys don't cry type of thing make them having a hard time to open up. So the same example that I share about like getting selected for a TEDx thing, if I have a problem, it would be hard for me initially to open up and ask for help. Second element, which is probably the one that will impact you the most if you're dating an avoidant, is the ability to accept the partner's perspective. In other words, it's being empathetic. How can I understand your world? As I said before, it's not a problem of communication, it's a problem of understanding. And so what will happen is they will either dismiss things, you shouldn't cry. Why are you crying for that? Right? And the problem is that most of the time, in the context of relationship, we try to put ourselves in our partner's shoes, right? So an avoidant will put themselves in your shoes. Why are you crying? Because you lost your grandmother. You shouldn't cry. She was 85. Okay. Because they wouldn't cry if their grandmother passed away. But that doesn't mean that your emotions are not valid. You have every right to grieve your grandmother, right? And that's the idea where sometimes it clashes when you don't necessarily, as an avoidant person, understand the other. So there's this element of dismissing and also avoiding things. Avoiding when, that's why they're always conflicts averse, is because it's another point of view. And I don't want to deal with that. And the third one is because they block emotions, they sometimes have a hard time really be themselves, letting go. And so sometimes, again, for example, not all avoidants will take everything. I don't feel I'm necessarily, the number 3 would necessarily define me. But maybe sometimes I withhold a bit and I keep things to myself because in a way, you want to be composed, right? You don't want to be too exuberant. And this element of emotional detachment. If I'm fully in the relationship, if I'm fully invested in the relationship, then it's harder to go. It's harder to let go, right? I can't be at the same time a fortress and being super open, connecting with people, right? So it's important to understand that that's why the avoidance really clash with this element of intimacy. So what it means if you're dating an avoidant, what it means for your relationship. So as we discussed, avoidant attachment style stems from a need for self-reliance because of those unmet needs. But also, and more importantly, intimacy feels like a threat because intimacy is clashing with my independence. Intimacy is clashing with this idea of I need to be self-reliant. Intimacy is about being vulnerable. It's about sharing to the world. I was about to say to the world. Sharing to your spouse, to your partner. These are my imperfections. These are my fears. These are the things I'm not so proud of. These are the things that worries me. Just saying those words is really scary and triggering for me. And so the thing is, of course, the problem is that that will push people away because you think they don't care. And again, this idea of like you put yourself in their shoes, dating an avoidant, you will always think, but if I was in their shoes and I had this problem or I had this success, I would share them with the person I love the most. It doesn't make sense that they wouldn't open up, but that's how they function, right? So understand that this idea is not against you. It's not directed against you. It's because of that protective, that coping mechanism. Let's look at practical things that you can apply in your dating life if you're dating an avoidant, because as you know, what I do is all about being practical, all about things you can apply in your dating life. Tip number 1 is to start small. The thing is, as we discussed, they need to feel safe. Avoidants need to feel safe before opening up. And usually when they're dating someone anxious or secure, our level of expectation, if you have an anxious attachment style, your level of expectation will be way, way higher because you're going to base those expectations or this level of intimacy on your level, on your baseline. But your baseline will be quite far from their baseline. And so rather than expressing those moments of vulnerability when you are arguing with them, when you disagree, when you're going at the in-laws, etc., try to find low pressure moments. So what I say to my clients is really having a proactive approach. People deal with difficult things in their relationship usually at the worst times, right? Because they're not proactive. They have something that bothers them and they keep it to themselves for maybe they have a good reason, but the thing is because they keep that to themselves, then this will resurface at the wrong time. And that will build trust incrementally, because if you discuss those things, if you open up on those things, if you also show them the way, they'll stop thinking, this is bad, this is threats. They'll start to feel like, okay, I kind of like it. Okay, I survived this. I was scary in the first place, but now I survived and I think it's okay. The more you do those things, the better they feel. The more sort of confidence around this process. And that's how you regain trust in them learning the process. Tip number 2 is to communicate without judgment, which is very hard. That's what you have to do. Avoid being too critical, because avoidance, as I said before, we like to think that we are strong. But in a way, we hate rejection. We hate to be criticized. And it's actually why we put that fortress. This is why we put those walls, because we don't want to be criticized. That's why I wouldn't necessarily talk about my projects or successes, etc. Because I would be scared for people to say, nah, not good enough. And so when you discuss sensitive topics, it's really to frame them with empathy. And so there are tools. Let me know in the comment section if you want me to develop some kind of guide to help you if you're dating an avoidant, some sort of conversation cheat sheet around that. So instead of saying you're so distant, try using effective non-verbal communication. I feel disconnected and I would love to understand how you're feeling. Okay, rather than you're wrong, you're distant, you're selfish. No, this is my experience. I feel this way. And I would love us, cooperation, to discuss about that. Let's be a team. Let's solve that problem together. Tip number 3 is boundaries. The boundaries that helps you to encourage growth. So obviously it's a fine balance. It's always hard, a little bit like raising kids. You need to find the right balance between respecting their need for space, but of course you don't want to be dating a fortress, right? You can't date a fortress. And nudging them to have a little bit more conversation, deeper conversation. So again, if you have an anxious attachment style and you feel like this need for space is unbearable, it's harder for you to deal with, there's probably something you can do developing a more secure attachment. But it's important to also assess that they need to do a bit of work and need to understand that intimacy is not a threat. And I'll discuss this in a second. And so one way to do that is ask open-ended questions and let them talk. You see what I see often The dynamic of anxious avoidant couples is that the anxious would be the talker, would be talking, because there are a lot of things they want to express. The avoidant would be the listener, which is in itself not bad, but you also need to be conscious that sometimes, maybe 10%, 20% of the time, you have to be the listener. Let them feel in control. This is very important if you want to help them. Again, we're talking about the different baseline. Telling them about a secret, telling them about what worries them at work is a huge step for them. And so leave them that space for them to explain, to discuss, without judgment, just welcoming what they have to say, without trying to fix a problem. Just being listening is what will also create this element of safety. Dating an avoidant. The thing is, intimacy, yes, it's crucial. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's a must-have. But I think what will be the game changer in your relationship with your avoidant partner is when they realize that actually intimacy is what will make the relationship more fulfilling. This is what will make the relationship more interesting. It's not, because if you reframe this, rather than it's a must-have, it's a condition, but actually experiencing the depth of a relationship, because it's something that's quite foreign for avoidant. As soon as they have this experience and understand the benefit of this, they'll be on board. What I found is, if you're in love, if you have feelings, if the person is also curious and have an open mind, you can be the role model. You can shape what it needs to be, what it is to be intimate, without judgment, without being I'm treating you like my kid, right? And that's where you have to be quite cautious. You don't want to be their therapist either. It's about being the role model of how communication needs to be. What will be the conversations? What will be the questions? The things we need to discuss. And again, it's back to the guide that I'm thinking to develop, and let me know actually if you want something, I will create it to help you out. What you have to understand, if you're dating an avoidant, or maybe you broke up with an avoidant, understand that this fear of intimacy is not directed towards you. It's a protective mechanism. Remember this castle. Remember this fortress. This fortress will be there regardless of you. This is their way of sort of protecting themselves from potential threats. And as we discussed, we create the narratives, we create those belief systems in our childhood. And that's how we create that blueprint of what needs to be a relationship. And so remember that intimacy is not about perfection. Building intimacy, it's about being open. It's about understanding also ourselves. And it's about having that level of communication or connection where we feel we can truly connect with our partner. And it's something you can teach your partner. Teach, I don't know if it's the right word, but show. Show to your partner. If you like this video, let me know. I think it's a new format. I'm going to try to do one study per week like this, in depth, about one specific concept or one specific study. Let me know in the comment section if you want more of them, if you want me to discuss any specific topic, and I'll see you next time. Take care.